I would like to tell you about the single most terrifying thing that I have ever experienced as a rookie cop. In fact, this messed me up so much that I left the force soon after. I just couldn't cope afterwards. I won't give any specifics such as where this happened, or an exact date. Even though I'm no longer in the job, there could still be repercussions somehow. God knows the nightmares shall be punishment enough. It started off as a regular call from dispatch. Neighbor had called in, saying that she had heard a commotion in the yard next door, and the sound of smashing glass. It was roughly 2 a.m, and had been loud enough to wake her up. She hadn't seen anything, but thought that she had heard a dog barking, which she'd also found weird, since the neighbor she was reporting about did not have a pet. We were treating it as a possible break-in, since the neighbor said the woman lived alone, so a domestic disturbance was likely. As usual, we were short on officers available for backup, with there already having been a shooting that evening that had been taken out most of the shift, as they dealt with multiple perpetrators and witnesses. So it was just me and my partner. These kind of calls weren't unusual, but since I was still kinda new, they always kept the adrenaline pumping. I'd only been in the job a couple of years, and I'd already seen 2 colleagues buried. We turned off the lights and sirens as we approached the property. My partner, whom we'll call him Joe, went to the front door. I headed to the back. Thankfully, there was a porch light on, so the yard was lit well. The neighbor who had called it in had mentioned hearing a commotion. There was trash everywhere. It appeared like whoever had broken in had first emptied out all the garbage cans and spread them all over the floor. Mindless destruction, or had they been looking for something? It was hard to tell. There was indeed a smashed window there. Usually, if somebody smashes a window, it's in order to reach through to an open door. I mean, anyone who watches a movie knows that. But this was a full window taken out, and it looked like whoever had gone through it had done so in a hurry, as there was blood on the remaining glass and what looked to be fur. I remember dispatch had mentioned a possible dog at the scene, but not belonging to the owner of the property. It seemed weird. Perps don't usually bring Shep for walkies when casing a joint. Anyway, I push the door and it opens. I radio to Joe that I'm going in and will open the front door for him. As I check the kitchen where the broken window is, there is now a trail of blood going all the way through the house. My gun is out, and I'm checking each room as I go through. But nothing. I let Joe in, and we head up the stairs, seeing more blood as we go too. Now, it would be exactly a surprise if I said that I had a really bad feeling about this. Not that any call that involves trails of blood ends well, but there was an extra feeling that something was very, very wrong. I will admit, I was scared. The closer we got to the bedroom, the more intense this feeling grew, and I would even go so far as to saying that I could sense evil in that house. Now, maybe that in hindsight, me looking back and adding memories of feelings, I can't say for sure, but I can tell you that what we found when we opened the bedroom door was the absolute epitome of evil. But just before we opened the door, we stood quietly outside it and listened, just for a second or two, to see if we could glean any extra information about where the perp might be in the room. We could hear what sounded like 2 people in there. 2 distinct sets of noises. One, we assumed was the female of the property, and it sounded like the poor woman was whimpering. But she was still able to make a noise and therefore be alive, which was a good sign. The second noise was more unusual, as it sounded like a heavy pant and a low growl. Now, we knew there had been a report of a dog being heard, but why couldn't we hear the second person? We busted to the door, guns out and ready. But I don't think we could have ever actually been ready for what we saw. I know for sure that I will never forget it. There was a lot of blood to start with, and we weren't sure who it all belonged to. The woman was lying on the bed. The covers had been thrown off. They were piled in a heap on the floor. She was wearing a nightie, which had been pushed up, exposing her legs and panties. They were covered in blood. There was a large wound on one of her legs, near to her ankle, and it looked, God help her, like a bite mark. The sight of the blood wasn't the most shocking thing about her. It was the look of terror upon her face, and then we saw why. I had rushed to the woman, while Joe had remained by the door, and now the perp appeared from behind it. I will just straight out tell you exactly what it was. A Dogman. Let me describe this thing for you. I won't ever forget what he looked like, since I see him every night in my dreams. I would guess around 6'5", very well built, strong as an ox, as my Nona would have said. Despite being covered in a dark brown, rough-looking hair, you could see its muscles rippling through, like it went to the gym. Think The Rock, but with fur. He wore no clothing, but the hair was all over, even on his face. He was bipedal, stood tall and proud, not like a dog who was begging, but like he was meant to be on his two legs. His arms and legs were in proportion to his torso, although the arms seemed to hang a little lower than a human's would. At the end of the powerful-looking legs were large feet, each with a large curled claw, kind of like a talon, and at the end of each long arm was a huge paw, again with razor-sharp-looking claws. That all led up to the head. If the body of this abomination was meant to resemble man by its shape, the head was 100% dog. I could have been looking into the face of one of our canine units. It was German Shepherd for sure, which may be some wolf thrown in. The small pointy ears were pressed down, the long black snout dripping. Small black eyes stared right at me, and the mouth was open. Curled lips and a snarl to show a very dangerous set of teeth. There was now fresh blood all around the maw, and that was when I also noticed more blood matting the hair on one side of its body. That must have been the blood trail that we had followed from the broken window. Now, I don't know about you, but when I watch a horror movie, and the hero doesn't bat any eye when they see the vampire, or creature, or werewolf, or monster, just instinctively somehow knows what to do to kill them. I always thought to myself, if I met a monster in real life, I'd probably soil myself and run away, or be completely frozen in fear. It's one thing to go onto autopilot and use your training when you're faced with a human, but there are no lessons at the academy about what to do when you meet a non-human foe. Suddenly, it leapt at me, and then I heard a bang. There was a flash, a howl, and a crash. Joe had managed to do one better than me, and had come out of his shocked stupor when the thing made to attack me and shot it. It had hit the beast, and then smashed through the upstairs window into the garden below. In the few seconds it took to look out, it was gone. There was a load more blood and hair in the rose bush below the window where it had landed, but it was now gone. Training kicked in, and then we dealt with the victim, stemming the blood flow on her leg until the EMTs arrived. The poor woman was absolutely traumatized, as you would expect. Thankfully, it had only been a physical attack, and I say only, knowing full well just how traumatic the entire thing was. Believe me, if it had gone from sniffing to worse. Anyway, she was patched up and allowed to go home. By then, I had already had the talk with the brass, told to change the statements, and told the party line was to be a human, messed up on PCP, had broken in looking for cash. There was no such Dogman. It wasn't long after that I left. And do you know the absolute worst thing about the entire story? People know about this, and it's being covered up. These creatures, these predators are real, and nobody, for whatever reason, is allowed to talk about it. I am a hunter. I've been hunting for years. I would consider myself experienced, but considerate. I keep to the seasons, abide by the rules and laws, and always safety first. I enjoy the thrill of the kill, but I also hunt for food. If I shot a deer, I bring it home and feed the entire family. I'm telling you all this to let you know that I'm not some sort of gun-toting crazy that goes out killing for the sake of it. I've also been doing it for a long time. I'm well into my 50s now, and began going out with my father when I was just a young teen. Again, this is just to let you know that I have seen many things, as you can imagine, out in the woods. That when I came across the animal I'm about to tell you about, I was confused, and I wasn't mistaken. It was turkey season, so I was out early, hoping to catch a big tom. I was looking to find somewhere to bunker down. It was around 5 in the morning or so, a touch of mist, and still quite dark. There was a profound dampness in the air. Since I'd been in the woods many times, I knew the exact place I wanted to make a sort of base. I headed over to the spot that I had used many times, as it had awesome coverage, with the trees, and a sort of dip in the ground, which seemed to almost be ready to be lie and waiting in. But, as I headed over, I was certain that I was in the right spot. Something felt off. Call it a gut feeling. Some sort of hunter's intuition, if you will. I can read a situation which has come in mighty handy many times before, and kept me out of a couple of tight scrapes. And that's what I felt now. That something wasn't right. As I said, it was still pretty dark, since it was early dawn, and I was more feeling my way from memory than actually being guided by any sort of light. I don't take a flash or nothing with me, so I hadn't seen what had decided to make me usual spot in my home, until I came closer than I would have if I had known. Thankfully, I heard before I saw, and what I heard made all the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. Dogs. I could tell it was dogs from the low growl, whining and yapping, and those sounds were the most alarming, as they seemed to be coming from a pub. Now, anyone knows that the worst kind of animal to encounter is a mama. They will do anything to protect their offspring, and quite rightly so. I wasn't sure why there would be a pack of feral dogs in the woods. I had never seen anything like them in there before, but I did not want to hang about. I was just about to try and sneak off when my cell phone began to vibrate. To say I was angry was an understatement. I always turn it off entirely before a hunt. Still, at least, it wasn't blurring out AC/DC. Maybe the vibration alone wouldn't attract any unwanted attention. But of course it did. Again, I heard it before I saw it. That growling noise. Only there seemed to be something very, very wrong. I stood up. I'm over 6 feet tall. That sound should have been coming from at the very most around the top of my leg area. Yet it seemed like it was coming from right beside me. And in fact, I could swear that I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. My first instinct was to run. But I also know that sometimes running away makes whatever is behind you give chase. I needed to turn to face this thing and show some human dominance. Yeah, right. But that's what was going through my mind. That and total blind panic. As I slowly turned, I came face to face with what I assume was the mama dog. Only she wasn't dog-sized. She was not wolf-sized. She was people size. A huge she-dog, as big as me. Not like an actual hound on 4 legs that just happened to be massive. This thing was standing on 2 legs, looking me right in the eye. She was built like a pro wrestler, covered in a thick reddish-brown fur. Her head reminiscent of that of a Doberman, with those tight, mean-looking features. Her teeth were bared, and every tooth, unlike that of a regular dog, was pinpoint tack sharp. Before I could even turn away, I wanted to run. I was scared out of my mind. I didn't even bother to draw my weapon, head out at her, try anything to defend myself. I was that frightened, right then, that I honestly thought she was going to kill me, and I just wanted it to be quick and as pain-free as possible. Yes, my life flashed before my eyes right there and then. Then, there was another sound. A tiny yip, a yelping noise. It was the pup, and it seemed to be gravitating towards its mother. The tiny pup, who when I got a quick look, was actually the size of a small boy. Saved my life, as Mama seemed to think whatever the pup needed was more important than me, right at that moment. She quickly made her way back over to the nest. I ran. I was no longer worried about whether she would give chase. I just hedged my bets, and she was more protective than aggressive, and wanted me away from her offspring, rather than to eat me. Thank the Lord that bet paid off, and I'm alive to tell you this story. I haven't been back to that spot. I don't necessarily have faith that it was a death wish, but I also have never told anybody about it. I try to be a sensible hunter. I have plenty of friends who would kill anything and everything they come across. They just like the killing part, and like to prove that they as men are on top of the food chain, the main predator on this planet. They'd be dumb to go out shooting lions and tigers, so if they knew about those creatures. I know that mama dog person was aggressive. I was sure, 100% sure that I had it. But she was being protective. You don't mess with moms. Those other hunters, though, they'd kill her and the baby. Wouldn't think nothing of it. Just carry the bodies out and parade them around to share all over the internet. I might have been more scared than I hope I'll ever be again, but I'm not cruel. The other thing is, if that was a baby and a mama, there must have been a dad. And if Mrs. Dogman was that big, what in the name is Mr. Daddy Dogman like? I was one of the Marines that had toured in Afghanistan the longest. It wasn't because I wanted to be there. It was because I was the one of the best in a firefight. I could keep my weapons hot and my head cool. When you're on the outside of the armed forces looking in, you see the medals you get when you survive through one disaster after another. When you're on the inside, you know that the real reward for surviving is going on missions with a slimmer chance of survival. Everyone else just dies faster. We were being dropped by a helicopter into an undisclosed location. I thought I had a pretty good grasp on the geography of the area, but looking down, I had no landmarks to properly guide me. It was wide open wilderness, like the underworld of some bad children's story. Our parameters were to gather whatever intel we could and neutralize any threats. That was by far the most vague and open-ended mission parameters that I've ever heard in my entire career. Who were the innocents? Were there any hostages? Were there any confirmed hostiles? Were we investigating to see if there were any hostiles? No such details were forthcoming. The last thing they told us was that we had an hour, and after that, they were leaving us there if we didn't come back out. That made me wonder if something had already been encountered at that location that nobody just came back from. But you didn't ask those questions out loud. We were kicked out in front of a caravan, set into a very spiky-looking mound of rock. It looked more and more like something from a bad story. I took point, and we turned on our light and plunged into the cave. It was remarkable how much cooler it was inside that cave than outside. It made me feel like I could breathe a little easier, but I still had to keep my wits about me. The first 5 minutes of crawling around in there had sold me on the idea that there were no people inhabiting the cave. The odd bone or two might have been left by some desert scavengers looking for shelter from the sun, but no people. I changed my mind in a hurry when we passed through a narrow opening into a room that was rank with the aroma of iron. Dark stains painted the walls all around and the ground. The horror show had officially begun. One thing led to another. Skulls with wooden stakes driven through them. Slabs of wood with rotting bodies stretched out and impaled with more wooden stakes, and whatever else could be used in a similar fashion. We were so caught up with the cascade of grisly revelations that we lost our focus long enough for a hostile to leap out of some shadowy hiding place and let loose a volley of bullets. Most of the shots missed. 2 found my armor and were safely buffeted. He wasn't wearing anything more protective than a cloth robe, and my retaliatory shot found his head. He joined the rest of the head wounds littering the chamber. The surprise attack had shaken us, and we were eyes up from that moment on. The intensity of that first room was just the beginning. Mutilated bodies became a common part of the decor. There was one small chamber where the floor was completely eclipsed by human remains. What kind of information was the CO wanting? I don't even think he knew. The answer was probably in an office somewhere. I've seen enough Indiana Jones movies that I should have been able to avoid what happened next. I guess I just didn't expect to see anything like it outside the movies. We stepped into yet another chamber that had a high ceiling. This is the part where we got really nervous. There were sounds in that chamber, animal noises that I could not place, and I don't think my men could either. There were some that sounded like wild boars, others like lions. There was a lot that just did not match up with anything, and that's when I stepped forward and hit a tripwire. A heavy wooden gate slid down, sealing us in. It must have been on some kind of pulley system, because another gate opened as soon as that one came down. We trained our lights on the black opening. All the animal noises seemed to be coming from there. We were not prepared for the speed with which anything would burst out of the doorway. We were half a second too slow on the trigger when my bullets had struck the doorway. Someone was already on top of one of my men. The seconds that followed, with me retraining my aim and firing, began to slow down. I saw the shape that had tackled my fellow soldier. It wasn't human. It was superhuman. Huge, muscular. Everything about it was taut with aggression. Its furry arms dealt one haymaker after another with blinding force and speed. I unloaded into the side of its ribs, shoulder and head. It landed on its back, stone dead, part of its hairy skull blown open. From the neck up, it looked like a very rugged German shepherd that had been in plenty of fights. From the neck down, it looked like a steroid-charged killing machine. All humanoid features, just very furry. I turned the light to my fallen soldier. His neck had been broken, and his face was peeled off. More grunts approached the opening of what was left, and we got ready. The gunfire created strobe lights in the cavern, and each flare was a snapshot of teeth and claws, and eyes that burned with a glow. There were at least 4 of them. I dropped 2 of them with volleys straight to the head. Shooting them in the chest didn't seem to do much, and a sickening cracking sound drew me over to see that one of them had breached a soldier's chest and was tearing into his ribcage. My light caught the movement of his lungs before clawed hands tore them out. It explained why I didn't hear him scream. The back of the monster soaked up nearly half of a magazine before it fell over. I shouted to whoever was left to get the exit unblocked. That maneuver cost us 3 more lives, as those 3 soldiers used themselves as shields to protect the Marine that broke the supports, keeping the barrier in place. 3 of us made it out. The people that orchestrated the operation wanted to know if we had completely taken care of all the hostiles. We weren't sure. They marked it as a mission failure, and all of us were discharged. I was able to connect with someone out of pure chance who had been sent on a similar suicide mission to the exact same region. Just a different cavern. If you've ever experienced anything like this, please reach out to me. We need to talk. I saw my men torn apart, with nothing but claws and fingers, from beings that looked like the Egyptian Anubis. I want to know why they were fed to these things, like cans of tuna. And I'll be vetting you when you contact me, just to make sure. I think you'll understand. Thank you for taking the time to read this. I will be arrested for sure if I tell you who I am and where this took place. So I'm just going to tell you that I'm part of a cleanup crew, hired to take care of the aftermath of one of the recent protests that turned violent on government property. No, I'm not referring to the Capitol building. That's not the first place that violence came to visit the suits and ties of American politics. It just hasn't been publicized as widely. The number of offices were trashed really good before police can turn the tide with their batons and tear gas. You don't realize just how much paper there is in government buildings until you have to clean it up. Desks were overturned. Filing cabinets were kicked over. Drawers were piled up and dumped out, looking like a war zone. This wasn't like past projects, cleaning up government property. For whatever reason, they wanted all papers and all other forms of storage of information destroyed. If we did a thorough job, we got triple the pay. If we leaked anything we found, there was a chance we could face a lifetime of imprisonment. So, we approached the job with compliant attitudes. It did confuse me as to why you'd keep such sensitive info in a place where the public was more or less free to come and go. But it also made sense to hide some things in plain sight, where people will never look for them. True to our assignment, every last paper, flash drive, disk, current and obsolete form of digital storage, and binder had been rounded up and shipped off to be incinerated. I was part of the final walkthrough that would make sure that nothing had been overlooked. We split up and did a once-over all the floors. Fallen behind a shelf on a sub-level was a single VHS tape. It was the only VHS tape that I had seen in the building. That was the only moment that I questioned if it would be worth risk of going to prison for the rest of my life. I kept it. I managed to smuggle it out of the building, and nobody caught me. My expectations for the tape were low. It would surely just be some personal project of some inventory, manifest-related material. The first 10 minutes were of the camera sitting on a table, filming an empty cage of sort. It was all metal, and the bars seemed or appeared to be very heavy. There were a host of locking mechanisms and levers, even gears. I think I saw buckles and straps, which made no sense. Then the film cut to a separate segment where the cage was occupied. Whatever it was crammed inside the cage, and it was not happy about it. It had no room to stand up or to sit down. The cage may as well have been an animal's coffin. I wanted to think it was some sort of gorilla, but even gorillas don't get that big. And gorillas also don't make sounds that fear-inspiring. The grainy quality of the tape made it impossible to pick out details of the black shape in the cage. Another jump cut to a small room, rectangular in shape with no windows and no visible doors. A hard-looking man, quite possibly a convict, was looking around, with a very confused expression on his face. Tattooed from head to toe, he muttered something in Spanish. He moved across all the walls as if probing for an exit. Apparently, he was not made aware there was a camera. A handwritten title screen appeared that said Training 03A. The camera cut back to the convict, but there was a lot of action taking place. He was up against the wall shouting, rambling. A black shape came up to him and towered over him. It was muscular and furry, like someone in a Halloween costume. The thing made a motion, as if slapping the man across the cheek. His cheek was sliced to ribbons, and the interior of his mouth was exposed. His tongue squirmed as he shrieked in pain, and painted the floor with blood. The more the shape tore the man apart, the more it dawned on me that it wasn't somebody in a costume. This hulking creature was slowly tearing the man apart, flesh to bone, and it seemed to relish the experience. For the short time the man had lips, I think I heard him saying a prayer. Then, his face was no more. The animal studied his flesh as if studying it. It didn't like the sounds the man made, so it forced its paw down on the unprotected throat. You could see it being shredded. The video cut to another human prisoner, this time a woman. She was also butchered in a similar fashion. The being or creature was facing the camera, more in that one, and it looked everything like you'd expect a werewolf to look like. I so wanted it to be a costume, but that fakeness you expect from a mask wasn't there. Everything was just so alive and moving, brimming with intelligence of a predatory killer. There were twitches and ticks that could not be simulated by a costume. The woman's death was not slow. There was much more on the tape, but I could not watch. I mentally reviewed every square inch of the government building, and couldn't recall anything that hinted at the presence of such thing. There may have been a sublevel, possibly. And that left me where I was before that I decided to ever submit this story. What do you do when you know something like this has happened? I can't show the tape for obvious reasons, and I don't dare identify myself. Who would put together such awful things? If that was indeed the work of the U.S. government, what were they trying to accomplish? My Uncle Brown talked me into going hunting with him. Not the worst thing in the world, except my uncle was prone to drinking when out hunting. His chances of hitting a clear target were reduced exponentially, and his odds of hitting something he shouldn't went up by just as much. He told me that he wouldn't drink on that particular outing, but he cracked a beer as soon as we got out into the woods, and said that he meant he wouldn't start drinking right away. So I hoped that the stink of beer would keep us from seeing any deer, so the world would be safe from my uncle's shooting. No such luck. There came a doe that was worthy of a magazine shoot. My uncle took a shot, and it was too sloppy. I don't even know where the shot went, but it did not hit the deer. He swore up a storm, with slurred words, and got himself yet another beer. I would have left him there, but the ride out there was his, and I shouldn't let him drive home in that condition. For whatever reason, my uncle took an interest in a fat squirrel that was leaping from tree to tree. It was the most embarrassing expenditure of ammunition I had ever seen. The squirrel practically barked in protest, but I think my uncle interpreted it as laughter, so he was that much more determined to shoot a hole in that thing. He shot holes in lots of things, just not in the squirrel. This led to him having another fit and swearing and throwing down his rifle. He was about to stomp on it, but he lost his balance and he fell over to the side. We went for a short stroll and stopped at the top of a hill. My uncle indicated some animal of interest at the bottom of the hill. He summarized that it was a bear. I couldn't tell. It was big enough to be a bear, but there was a lot of underbrush and plants blocking my full view. He took yet another careless shot. Any other time he would have missed, but a yelp told me that the shot had landed true. I don't know that I'd ever seen an animal move so quickly. Whatever that was, it went flying up the side of the hill at my uncle, and I took the hint that it would be a great idea if I didn't just stand there and take it all in. Something like a wolf that walks on two legs did a dolphin dive up into the air, coming down on my uncle. I landed the luckiest shot of my life with my own rifle. Blew one of its eyes, and it collapsed on top of the flailing drunk. He had a huge chunk bitten out of his shoulder, and it called for a trip to the ER. He wouldn't shut up about making sure nobody else bothered the corpse of the dog monster. But I was more worried about making sure he wasn't going to bleed out. Plus, I didn't fancy hunting with him a second longer than necessary. We got him all patched up, and he was itching to get back out to where we'd been to collect the carcass and whatever equipment we had left behind. I reluctantly agreed to go along with him for one trip back, as long as we weren't going to hunt. It took a few days before they'd let him go. The food we had left behind, including my uncle's beer, was ransacked. Probably the work of actual bears. The body of the wolf monster was gone. As luck would have it, either picked apart or carried away by another hunter. So to this day, the man tells the story about how he was nearly slain by the man-dog from hell, and how his quick reflexes were the only reason he's alive to this very day. He tells about how he had to calm me down while he was about to bleed out, so that I could drive him to the ER. I've stopped correcting him. It's his word against mine, and I'm the more sober of the two of us, so I figure anybody with any sense will understand that he's full of it.